by other people. I wanted to start by drawing attention to the title of the big CWI article that we had on our reading list, The Capitalist Vampire Squid. And I wanted to say that they got that term from, as some of you might know, from Matt Taibbi's article in the Rolling Stone magazine, which if you haven't read, I would strongly recommend that. It's a fantastic article. He actually uses the metaphor of a vampire squid to describe Goldman Sachs, because he says, everywhere you go, there's Goldman Sachs with its tentacles deeply entrenched in every aspect of the global economy, and they're really, it's basically squeezing the life out of the economy. And I think they're appropriate. The CWI is appropriate to use that metaphor for capitalism itself, because that is precisely what is happening, and that's precisely what has been happening all throughout capitalism. But it is especially clear to us during the crisis of capitalism, during its spectacular failure. What better way to start the discussion by talking about how bad the global economy is. I mean, the U.S. we've still been spared the worst brunt of it yet, but as we all know, what's happening in Europe is just really not surprising to Marxists by any means, but stunningly horrific in its impacts. And often, I think when we are doing serious analysis of the economy and what's happening in Europe, I think we sometimes miss out on the fact that this economic crisis is not in the abstract by any means. It is causing enormous untold hardship for real people. I mean, think of the 300 million unemployment that has been created. And I'm sure that's a ridiculous underestimate. If you really looked into it, it's probably more. If you look at individual countries like Spain and Greece, as we know, these are depression-level unemployment rates. We're talking about 15 to 25% overall unemployment rate, and over 50% for youth. This is incredible, and these are measured unemployment rates. So actual unemployment rates are far higher than that. I just wanted to, before I get into what's happening in Greece and everything, I wanted to just quickly, deal with an overview of why this crisis happened. I mean, as Marxists often say, this is a built-in crisis in capitalism. It's not something that is uniquely happened. I mean, bourgeois economists will say that, it was because of the deregulation, this systematic deregulation process in the financial sector, which is absolutely true. That that completely facilitated the building of this crisis. But as we know, it's this crises are built into the capitalist system, and hopefully someone else will go into what the crisis of overproduction is and so on. But I just wanted to quickly touch on the whole bailouts and austerity thing, because that's the basis of everything that's happening in Europe, all the political events happening in Europe. And so in terms of this particular economic crisis, the economic crisis is the outcome of the financial collapse. And I wanted to say that, inherently in capitalism, what we see in movies like Inside Job, the toxic asset trading and the speculative trading and all the capital flowing into the financial sector, that's not an isolated instance that just started 20 years ago. This is something that's ongoing. But what is probably unique about this period is that that whole the whole toxic pursuit of capital in the financial sector happened at such a scale that it resulted in a total collapse of the global economy. So I think we should also highlight the scale at which this is happening, not simply sort of incorrectly think that something unique happened in the last 20 years. And suddenly, the capitalist class woke up in 1980 and decided to be more greedy than usual. That doesn't make sense. The system sort of, is inherently generating that. But basically, just the overview of that is all that thing, all the stuff that we're talking about, or what happened in the financial sector. It was inevitably going, it was a bubble, and it was inevitably going to burst at some point, because toxic assets mean that it is an inflated value that does not really exist. Unlike if you have a house and there's a real value attached to that house. Imagine a $200,000 house not having a market value of $200,000, but $1,000,000. It does not really reflect the value of the real assets that are represented in the house, but it's completely inflated. That sort of thing is inherently short-lived. It is going to, at some point, collapse. But it needs for that to happen at like I said, at a massive scale, and then it sort of all goes under. It sort of implodes. But what's happened is really a good illustration of how the capitalist class operates. So we cannot have a sort of a dry discussion of economics without actually understanding what role the capitalist class, the ruling class itself, plays into shaping economic events. So they were well aware, like we know Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase, they're basically, let's face it, they're completely shameless and blatant in what they did. They were completely aware of what was happening, but they knew that they would not be footing the bill for when the whole thing imploded. And so, one thing we should clarify is when people say that, Greece has too much debt, that's a problem, Greece needs to solve that problem. Spain has too much debt. But where did this debt come from? I mean, when you say Greece has debt, what is Greece? It's a country full of different classes. So when you say Greece has debt, who has that debt? It's really the debt that was created by the private, profit-making, vampire squid in the financial sector. And when that became too hot to handle, it was converted into what's called sovereign debt. But sovereign debt basically is, it goes in the name of the government. But when you say it's government's debt or sovereign debt, basically it means that people, ordinary people like us, are going to be responsible for it. But it was artificially done. It's not like when you say Greece has debt, it doesn't mean that the Greek working people did anything. All these stories about the the lazy Greeks sitting in the coffee shops and drinking ouzo or whatever. These are completely mythical stories, because if you look at the reality of Greece, this is probably, I think, as far as I know, the least paid working class in the Eurozone. They've had years of decimated, benefits and everything. So these are not the people who were living extravagant lifestyles. This debt was artificially converted into government or public debt from the private sector. And that was done through the bailouts. So, the only way the bailouts will make sense is if you can see that this process is necessary for the ruling class, for the owners of capital, to shield themselves from the effects of what they're doing, of their own acts. But then, the interesting thing is that once that private debt got converted into sovereign debt, now the same ruling class, the bondholders, the bond market that everybody talks about, now they're saying, oh, look at you Greeks, you have this debt, so now you have to pay us for it because we are not going to foot the bill. I just wanted to say quickly that there is a really interesting term that Paul Krugman, liberal economist, has come up with. He says that this is what he would call, as a New York person, he would call it chutzpah. And he described chutzpah as somebody who murders his parents and then pleads clemency at to the judge on the basis of being an orphan. So it's like, you do this, you put it on their backs, and then say, oh, look at what you did, you lazy Greeks, now you pay us. And so that's where austerity comes in. So the only way we can make sense of the whole bailout austerity thing that the capitalist class is doing is by understanding that whole process. A lot of people ask, why are they doing austerity if it doesn't make sense? I mean, it makes sense from their perspective. The only thing that is not working for them is that the people are not going to take it lying down, which should be the major part of our discussion. But going back to what the effects of this whole bailout austerity process has been is it's the virtual wiping out of the middle class. I mean, we all have heard stories about how the middle class is just sort of almost disappearing. People in Greece who had regular lifestyles now scavenging in dumpsters just to get food. The exodus from Athens to the countryside to just because they can grow food, because there's no money. I mean, this is an incredible change that has happened, and I think that's precisely the problem that the ruling class has, because the working class in Greece and other countries is just sort of stunned and outraged, and that has led to a lot of these movements. And I think Greece is an excellent starting point to talk about it. We all know that it's been a stunning reduction in their a stunning contraction of their economy. Within 4 years, by the end of 2012, it is estimated that the Greek GDP would have gone down by 20%. This is unheard of, really, in the history of the capitalist economy. And so, and we know that the Greek population has been reacting to it. There have been, as far as I know, I think 17 general strikes. There was, I think, 2 of them were 48-hour general strikes. There's been continuous momentum in protest against these, these horrible conditions. But in addition to movements on the street, the consciousness has also reached into other sectors, like the election sector. So the whole bourgeois political machine in Europe is in crisis because it has lost credibility in the eyes of the people. And so, and not just Greece, I would say in other countries in Europe as well. So there are several examples of this. I mean, I'm going to obviously talk about the Greek elections, but very quickly, Berlusconi being driven out, Sarkozy being defeated very decisively is a reflection of a very, very clear anti-austerity vote that is happening in the Eurozone. And surveys have showed Sarkozy to be the most unpopular president in France's history. And this is quite incredible. I mean, the guy was so arrogant, and he didn't expect this to happen. But what's missing is a real challenge to. I mean, yes, it was a decisively anti-austerity vote, but what options do the people have to vote for? So in France, for example, the so-called Socialist Party has come to power, and Francois Hollande. But from the very beginning, he's been. Already you can tell that they are not about to come up with any real solutions to this problem. And in terms of Greece, the elections in June, the second round of elections have been really interesting. Just some numbers. I think in December 2009, Syriza, just to introduce, I mean, for those of you who are not aware, Syriza is this sort of loosely left-leaning coalition, which has, in order to describe its character, we have to talk about how it's changed over the period because it's not been static. But that is something that our sister organization, Zakinima, has been involved in. And so it's interesting to look at what's happening in Greece and how the consciousness is shifting. I think it's interesting to see how Syriza's fortunes have changed and how the Communist Party's fortunes have changed. So it would be an interesting comparison. In December 2009, Syriza, I think, got about 6% of the electoral vote. In May of this year, they got 18%. And in just 4 weeks from then, in the second round of elections, they got over 27% of the vote. And so, going 10 percentage points in 1 month, that really is not so much a reflection of Syriza itself, but how much it is being pushed to the left by the consciousness of the masses. And I wanted to relate this to some of the things that were coming up in our, for those of you who were here on Thursday night at the bonfire discussion, it was a fantastic discussion, but I felt like one of the themes was how hard it is to be a socialist, what was my worst paper sale ever, and ultimately we have to rely on this tiny, number of people who agree with us, and, that's our family, and all that is true, but I would also ask us to look at how quickly things can shift. I mean, it was a dramatic shift that's happened in Greece, and the gains that Syriza has made is really a reflection of how people can move quickly into struggle under the pressure of the crisis, and they will move the leadership even though they may not themselves be clear about that. I mean, it's not like a Marxist leadership in Syriza. And then you compare that to the KKE, which is the Stalinist Communist Party. They went from basically, first of all, in the May elections, they got 8% of the vote. But what's striking about this is not so much that they got 8%, but the fact that in comparison to the 2009 elections, they got only 19,000 more votes. I mean, that is a really tiny on, and that reflects the loss of legitimacy that they've had. But and on top of that, they got 8% in May, and then in the June elections they went down to 4%. Or I mean, I'm estimating it's probably 8.5 and 4.5, but basically they went down by half.